The United States' recent operation in Venezuela, called Operation Southern Spear, sparked praise from Republicans, outrage from Democrats. But what if I told you that there aren't just two sides to the issue? What exactly happened with the United States operation in Venezuela? What is the relationship between the United States and Venezuela? And what do Venezuelans think about the United States and their now deposed President Maduro? We're joined by Aldrin Ballesteros, a policy consultant specifically on issues in that region. And he's going to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Starting last fall in 2025, the United States began an operation called Operation Southern Spear in Venezuela. It began with targeting some boats that the United States claimed were doing human and drug trafficking into the United States, and it culminated earlier in 2026, shortly after the new year, when the United States ran an operation to kidnap and depose Venezuelan President Maduro, who is now standing trial in the United States. Republicans largely praised President Trump and his administration for the operation and success. Democrats largely condemned it. But the reaction around the world was mixed. And the issue, as often is the case with these issues, is a little bit more nuanced than perhaps the press makes it out to be. We're joined today by Aldrin Ballesteros. He is the managing partner of BM Group and the policy and marketing consultant for Serendipity. He is a policy expert in that region, and he joins us today. Aldrin, welcome back to Face the Issues.
Hello, Sam. Happy New Year. It's a pleasure to be here again, starting fresh with a great show and very interesting subject matter, as always.
Yeah, absolutely. And Aldrin, I appreciate you being with us and joining us. Let's start from the beginning. You and I have talked before about how a lot of times the public isn't always aware of where we are talking. So we are talking about the nation of Venezuela. It is in northern South America. So it is in South America, but on the northern end of South America. Give us an overview of Venezuela and their form of government and that kind of stuff.
Sure, absolutely. So thinking through my understanding of Venezuela this morning, I realized 5-year-old Aldrin probably knew more about Venezuela when he was 5 years old than he did about Mexico or the US, because I remember even then, I'm talking about 2004, 2005, I would sit with grandma and Univision would be on, and Hugo Chavez would always be on the screen. And as a 5-year-old, how much of a personality is someone to captivate or to have the attention of a 5-year-old? So I think to understand Venezuela, we need to understand Hugo Chavez, who's a central figure, who was president of Venezuela since 1999, and who represented what many believed was a change for Venezuela, a change for the better. And for those who don't know Hugo Chavez is, at the end of the day, or was a populist president. And that's where the whole debate sparks. You'll speak to Venezuelans who will continue standing their ground and saying that Hugo Chavez and his movement was beneficial for Venezuela and was a positive change. But then you'll have the opposition who understand, and I'm much more on that end, that yes, he was a populist president, and yes, some people benefited from his immediate policy actions and social programs, but that was at the expense of developing a long-term stability for the country. And to this day, many people do not understand that what Hugo Chavez did back in his day affected Maduro and was a continuation of what he did, and have us in this huge historic turmoil today that has the entire world looking at Venezuela.
So Maduro, the president that was just removed, is a successor, if you will, to Chavez. This is not an opposition party. They're both cut from the same cloth.
Correct. So again, Chavez took office in 1999, and similar to Trump in the United States, similar to Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico, he was a charismatic fellow. And he was someone who was looking to provide for the people. At least his messaging was. And he was able to provide a lot of stability for many Venezuelans, especially in the lower income bracket. How so? Oil. Oil is usually the answer to many geopolitical questions, and it is in this case. In the 1970s, Venezuela had a huge boom in their oil industry. And when Hugo Chavez took charge, he used the money that was created by this industry and funneled it specifically towards social programs. Now, social programs, as you know, are a very important part of policymaking and of having a government. By no means am I against social programs, but what did happen in Venezuela was that the money was primarily used for social programs that did not incentivize an economy, did not diversify an economy, did not create further industries, as has been the case in the Middle East, where oil money has been channeled towards new industries like tourism, for example. And so what happens is after, I believe, 4 terms, because Hugo Chavez did amend the Constitution several times. Um, he stayed in power until 2013, but he passed away due to cancer. Now, in this abrupt change of not regime, but of a leadership, what happened is Hugo Chavez elected or hand chose Maduro as his successor. And there was an electoral process, and Maduro did win, but it was a hand-picked succession. But I remember, again, I was probably 15 years old when this happened. And I remember Maduro in his first year saying that he was in his home and a bird came to his window, and the bird was Hugo Chavez. And the bird told him to take care of the nation of Venezuela. So since then, you could get a hint of the interesting character and a very flawed character that was Maduro, who's now here in the United States.
And the United States has always had a tried relationship with Venezuela from the time Chavez took over, right? Before that, different situation. But when Chavez took over in 1999, Bill Clinton was president of the United States. And Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden have all had rocky relationships with Venezuela since Chavez and Maduro took over. So this notion that there was a friendly relationship that President Trump broke from, that's not entirely accurate.
Yeah, correct. Again, going back to my memories of 5-year-old Aldrin watching Univision, the phrase "El imperialismo Yankee," screamed by Hugo Chavez, was something that always came to mind. And
he wasn't talking about the baseball team, was he?
Definitely not talking about the baseball team. It took me at 5 years old. I probably thought it was a baseball team. At 7, I kind of realized, okay, there's something different here. But yes, he would always point to, and this is a card that is usually used in Latin America, and it's a very contentious topic because, to an extent, yes, the United States has a vast history of intervention in Latin America, and in most cases, or every case, it has not gone well. So there is a very valid point there. But I think in this case, Venezuela, and as other movements in the past have done, it's a very treacherous path to take that narrative and use it as a shield for every single wrongdoing that is happening in your country, as opposed to enacting policy that separates what has happened and, okay, where are we and how do we create a more stable economy, a more prosperous country?
And to your point earlier, Audrey, you said Chavez, remember he amends the Constitution so he can run for more terms, right? And this is kind of where some of the dictator tagline starts coming. We do this when you see Vladimir Putin did it in Russia. Xi Jinping has done it in China. Maduro does similar, right? I mean, in 2013, he requests laws are amended that he can fight corruption. And then he uses that power to seize private companies and to seize goods and so forth. In 2015, the opposition party wins parliament. But by 2017, the Supreme Court of Venezuela has ruled that they're in contempt of the court rulings. And then the court takes over legislative authority, which is a constitutional crisis that occurs. And that's what it leads to. And then, of course, the 2018 election, where most countries, including ours, and this is not a bipartisan or a partisan issue in America, both President Trump and President Biden refused to recognize Maduro as the rightful leader after the latest election. And so there's a lot, most countries recognize his opposition as the rightful leaders of Venezuela. How does that, I mean, first of all, is all of that, to your knowledge, accurate? But secondly, how do you see that? And how do people in Venezuela see Maduro now?
Sure. So there's again, bringing Chavez just slightly to contrast both characters. The difference in their overstayed welcome lies in their charisma and their populist character, as well as in the ability of the oil industry to back up any claims that they made. So yes, Chavez overstayed his welcome several times, but one, again, he was a populist, charismatic character who was able to convince the public that they were better off with him. And secondly, the oil industry at that point in time would still be able to provide him the social programs that he would need to convince people that they were better off. Because in fact, a lot of people who I've spoken to have said, "Hey, one specific case, my grandfather is Venezuelan, and he said that he had never been better than with Chavez, and that's their reality, but they don't understand the economics and policy behind it." Now, Maduro comes into power, and two things happen. One, Maduro has the charisma of a rock. There is no charisma in that that human being, and that matters in politics. We see it in the United States today. But secondly, the oil industry crumbles in Venezuela. So there's no longer that ability to sustain social programs that keep the people happy. So what happens? Maduro turns to taking control of the courts and taking control of the military in order to exact his regime and maintain that power. From afar, you'd say, well, why don't the Venezuelan people revolt, or why didn't they do this in 2014, 2015, 2018? Well, they tried, but many of those people who fought for liberty and for change ended up dead, ended up in prison, ended up tortured. I can tell you countless of examples of people who have told me about these anecdotes, and that's the huge contrast and the reason why Maduro is such a terrible character and who deserves to be presented onto justice, because it's not just an overstayed presidency. It's not it's a dictatorship, a terrible dictatorship.
Yeah. Audrey, we're going to go a break, but don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website lighthousetv.org for more information. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Audrey, let's pick up where you left off. You had talked about Maduro overstaying his welcome, the kind of strongman tactics that he used, really becoming a dictator. And this explains why, after his capture, there's dancing and partying in the streets throughout Venezuela. And I think it illustrates a really important point for our viewers to understand, that two things can be true. This idea of multiple views, that we are discussing Venezuela and the country and the perspective of Maduro from Venezuela. That is not, what we're not doing here is justifying the constitutionality of the administration's actions. And we've had the previous show discussing that, and what are the constitutional restrictions to what the presidency, to what Congress may or may not do. And I think a lot of times in political discourse, that gets missed, that, well, if Maduro's a bad guy, then the United States may break whatever constitutional restraints or international laws they need to in order to take care of him. And obviously, that's not in the Geneva Convention, the just war tradition. That's not something that we abide by. So we're not, and we're not here. You're not here defending that the administration was within their rights, what they're doing. But you are giving us this incredibly important insight into who Maduro is and to what Venezuela was like under him. And so I wanted to start with that clarity. And I want to ask you, Audrey, what is that relationship between Maduro and the United States like? What has that relationship been?
Could you repeat that last part? I'm so sorry, Sam.
What has the relationship between the U.S. and Maduro been like?
So the relationship between the U.S. and Maduro has been, and actually I'll bring a couple of other characters into play that are important to understand that relationship. So, and those characters are China, and those characters are Russia. So at the end of the day, when you talk about these global powers, that's how the relationship is understood. And between Venezuela and Maduro, specifically in the United States, the relationship was simply not there. But what does it mean when a country like Venezuela, when a leader like Maduro doesn't have a relationship with the United States? Well, it means that that country and that dictator will likely create these relationships with another global power, either Russia, either China, and that's something that we saw. And there was a very viral TikTok that happened when Maduro was captured, of a Venezuelan saying, "Well, what do you think the Chinese and the Russians wanted? The recipe for arepas in relation to the United States intervening." And that's a very valid point, because a lot of people are blaming the United States for these actions, and there's obviously a very treacherous path that can be followed if you allow a country like the United States to maintain interventions. But the reality is that it did have its benefits. And in regards to the relationship between Maduro and Trump, well, and the United States in general, it really wasn't there as much. Where I did see a change or a red flag was when late last year we saw Trump actually execute operations in waters to take care of it, as he would say, of some boats that would have drugs as cargo going towards the United States. And I saw that, as soon as I saw that, the first thing that came to mind is, okay, he's testing Maduro to understand if he'll comply or align with the United States objective. Again, not saying in favor or against. That's what I interpreted that as. And as soon as Maduro remained hostile, I did think for a point, okay, the Trump administration is now identifying Maduro will not comply. What next steps will we take? Never would I have imagined that January 3rd was going to be the exact next step. But that's how I saw that.
With Maduro out, there was some talk that Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and it is still hers, regardless of whether she gifted it to President Trump, it is hers, that she's been the opposition leader, that perhaps that the United States would try to install her. President Trump has been very vocal that he does not believe she's fit to lead. So who is currently leading Venezuela?
Sure. So that's a very good question. And I think that's the question that should be conversed about. Yes, we could sit down and talk about whether this was a net good or net bad, the removal of Maduro. But the reality is he has been removed, and we are at a new stage. Now, the thing is, who takes those reins when you take away a dictator? There's a vacuum of power, and initially I assumed that Maria Corina Machado was going to be immediately brought into power, but I didn't think of the logistics. And after listening to President Trump, after listening to Secretary Rubio, I came to understand the logic behind them leaving Delcy Rodriguez, who was a very close ally of Maduro, as the interim president per se. And if you've seen statements by Marco Rubio, he's come to suggest that there's a need for a first step of sort of like stabilization, because there's a huge risk if you take out Maduro that there's going to be complete upheaval within the Venezuelan government. How do you counter that? Well, you kind of choose the best of two evils, which is having Delcy Rodriguez, who's still part of the Maduro regime, who still has the same ideals, but allowing her to sort of be a liaison to comply with U.S. Petitions, which of course there's a whole other conversation of does the U.S. have a right to tell a country what to do? But in this instance, Delcy Rodriguez, who was, to sum it up, a right-hand person to Maduro, is now the president, but her role is not of someone who will remain in power. Her role is of someone who will listen to the United States requests. And given that she is deeply involved in the existing government, she will allow that apparatus to slowly shift towards the U.S. petitions, and eventually, as the administration has suggested, there will be new elections, but there isn't a time frame. But if you analyze it in a very cold and neutral manner, I do think out of all the options that you could have, there is a logic behind it.
The President Trump has suggested that the United States is now running Venezuela, and from what you're explaining, it seems like they're trying to do it through the interim president. Is there a concern in South American and Latin American countries that this administration, if this is successful, will continue to do this, where they will depose leaders that are not cooperating in an attempt to run the country themselves?
There's a huge concern. Like the day after Maduro was captured, I was very surprised to see so much involvement online in Mexico. Specifically, there were protests in Mexico, and I'm sure there were protests in other countries in Latin America. Again, for this, as a Mexican American myself, you grow with two narratives and two histories. One is what we learn in school here in the United States, but there's also this cultural narrative of the U.S. has always intervened and has always made it worse for Latin America. And that is a very strong current of thought. Not everyone believes it. As I mentioned earlier, I think there's also a terrible path that can be followed if you only follow the narrative, because that leads to countries not looking to prosper by their own policy actions. But yes, there is that fear in the everyday person who has conversations at a coffee shop, and it's also a fear in at a government level. It hasn't been as vocal in some, but I know for a fact in Mexico, for example, the president has been very vocal about giving messages that make the people feel at peace. Not so much attacking the United States, but sort of framing, hey, we are a sovereign country, and using the term sovereign as a perfect key word that keeps being regurgitated so that the general population is calm. But yes, there is a fear.
Yeah. Audrey, thank you for breaking down all that's happening in Venezuela, helping us get a better understanding of that country and their relation to the United States. I appreciate you doing that.
Thank you very much, Sam. I appreciate the space, and I hope that I did some well for all those Venezuelans who have taught me, who have been very vocal these past years. And I know all of them are very excited for this new chapter, but also very cautious. So it's a bittersweet moment, but an ultimate positive step, I believe.
Yeah. Thank you, Audrey. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up. How to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. We close tonight by paying tribute to two gentlemen who defined the term gentleman. The first is my dear friend, Ron Verdin. Ron had served as a professor of mathematics at Lehigh Carbon Community College, on the staff, and later on the elder board of my home church, Faith Church in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I'd known Ron since my middle school days, and he was always the one that looked out for everybody, that treated everybody with the same respect and the same love that we all wish we could be treated with. At his memorial, his son-in-law said, if you knew Ron, you probably knew that he loved everybody, but felt like he loved you a little bit more. And that's absolutely the way that he made you feel. The incredible thing about Ron Verdin is that when he was young, he was in a near-death car accident. And for the last 50 plus years of his life, he lived every day with physical pain, later compounded by health problems and diagnoses and treatments, daily pain, and yet I never once in my life heard him complain. What he always said to me in these final years was that he had lived a good life, and his only wish was now to die well, to glorify his Creator in the way he died. And he passed a few weeks ago doing just that. The second person we pay honor tonight is Jamie Yeh, or as I affectionately called him, Uncle Jamie. Jamie showed me that being family wasn't just about blood. He was someone that my father had mentored when he had first come to the United States, and then someone who in turn treated me with that love and respect and mentored and helped me. We stayed in touch all those years later, known him for about 30 years of my life, and he was always Uncle Jamie. He was the one that looked out for us. He was the one that took care of us. If I needed anything, I knew I could go to him, even though we weren't related by blood. He was in law enforcement and worked in our national security sectors, and was someone that was deeply respected by people from all backgrounds, all political parties, all races, all religions. He passed suddenly in the last few weeks at just 50 years of age, and when you see the outpouring of love that he has received from people from all walks of life, it speaks volumes to the character of that remarkable man. And so we pause today to say thank you to Ron Verdin and to Uncle Jamie for the example that both of them have set for people like me and for everyone in their communities, everyone who knew them, for representing their Creator, for exemplifying what it meant to be a gentleman and to be a follower of Jesus. Mr. Verdin, Uncle Jamie, thank you for the love and care that you showed me, for the example that you set for me and for so many others. Godspeed, and we'll see you again in heaven. That's our show for tonight. I want to thank each of you for tuning in, and we hope to see you again right back here next week. Until then, my name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.